Darkness still clung to the barracks as the heavy door creaked open. The German pilots, captured only days earlier, shuffled into the yard under the eyes of American guards. Their boots dragged through the dust, their uniforms rumpled from nights of interrogation and transport. Many had not slept. Their eyes were red-rimmed, fixed on the ground. The expectation of what awaited them pressed like a weight across their shoulders: hunger, humiliation, perhaps even blows from men who had lost friends to their bombs. They braced themselves for scorn. They braced themselves for silence. They braced themselves for the slow erosion of dignity that every prisoner fears. And yet, what happened next shattered those grim assumptions. From a makeshift kitchen hut, steam rose into the chill of dawn. One guard, barely older than some of the pilots, stepped forward carrying tin mugs that gave off the unmistakable aroma of coffee. He placed them, one by one, into the hands of the men who only days earlier had soared over Europe and tried to rain destruction on American soil. For a moment, no one moved. The first sip brought an involuntary pause, bitterness, warmth, and a rush of disbelief. Coffee, real coffee, black and hot, not the watery substitutes of occupied Europe. A luxury that even officers in Germany could scarcely obtain by 1943 was here. Offered without ceremony to the defeated, the paradox was brutal. These men, trained killers in the sky, had destroyed homes, factories, and airfields. But now their enemies treated them with a courtesy they had never imagined. One pilot, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Vogel, later recalled in a diary fragment smuggled back to his family. "The first morning in America will never leave me. I expected to be spat upon. Instead, they handed me coffee as if I were their neighbor. It was not propaganda, it was routine, as natural to the Americans as breathing. A mug before breakfast, a gesture of habit. But for the Germans, it was an earthquake in the mind. The contradiction was sharper still when compared to the rumors they carried from the front. German soldiers still clinging to the ruins of Stalingrad had received little more than frozen bread crusts. At home, mothers queued for hours for ration cards that no longer guaranteed sugar or flour. Yet here, in the land they had been told was decadent and weak, even captives drank better than free men in Berlin. The coffee was not merely a drink, it was a message, silent yet undeniable. The war had not prepared them for this kind of psychological blow. The yard fell into a strange silence that first morning. Steam curled from dozens of tin mugs, rising into the pale American sky. The smell alone seemed to mock the collapsing Reich. For some, the taste brought shame. For others, quiet gratitude. But for all, it marked the beginning of a transformation that would unsettle every assumption they carried across the Atlantic. The years 1943 to 1945 saw the tide of war turn in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the sharp edge of Hitler's war machine, began to falter under the relentless weight of Allied production. By late 1943, B-17s and B-24s swarmed across the continent, escorted by the new long-range P-51 Mustangs that tore into German formations. Casualty rates for German aircrews soared. Some squadrons reported losses of up to 60% on single missions. For every plane destroyed, a pilot or gunner often parachuted into captivity. Many of these airmen expected the camps of America to resemble what they had seen in occupied Europe: barbed wire, starvation, cruelty. Instead, they were loaded onto ships, carried across the Atlantic, and delivered into a world utterly foreign. By 1944, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across the United States, from the pine forests of Arkansas to the wide plains of Texas. Among them were hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots, men who had once believed America to be soft, unprepared, incapable of sustaining war. What they found contradicted every whisper of Nazi propaganda. Coffee, that dark and bitter drink, became a symbol of this difference. In Europe, beans had all but vanished. Families roasted acorns or chicory to create bitter substitutes, and officers hoarded tiny rations like treasure. In Berlin, a single pound of real coffee could fetch a month's wages on the black market. In the occupied East, soldiers sometimes wrote home that they would give a week's pay for a single cup. Yet, in America, coffee was everywhere, poured into the mugs of steelworkers before their shifts, sipped by farmers at dawn, and yes, served even to prisoners. The Americans themselves thought little of it. Coffee was a necessity of daily life, a comfort as routine as bread. The guards at the camps carried thermoses. The cooks brewed it in great vats, and the aroma drifted across the barracks every morning. For the German pilots, it was shocking proof that their enemy's abundance stretched far beyond propaganda. If America could waste such luxuries on captives, what did that say about its power? Letters written by the prisoners revealed the sting of comparison. One young pilot, Unteroffizier Dieter Müller, scribbled in a censored note to his sister in Leipzig. "Every morning there is coffee, real coffee. Do not tell the neighbors, I fear they would not believe me. At home, you are lucky for barley soup. Here, a prisoner is treated as though he were a guest." The words never reached her, cut by censors who feared their impact. But the note survives in archives, a testament to the quiet astonishment of men caught between two worlds. The simple act of pouring coffee drew a sharp line between scarcity and plenty, between the collapsing Reich and the industrial giant across the ocean. It was more than a drink, it was a daily reminder that they were trapped in a war they could not possibly win. The first days inside the camps were filled with dread for the German pilots. Defeat carried with it an almost ritual humiliation. They had been drilled to expect scorn, to brace for starvation, perhaps even to steel themselves for the cold indifference of an enemy who had every reason to hate them. The weight of their capture pressed harder than the shackles of iron. In whispered conversations in the barracks, they predicted what tomorrow would bring: long hours of hard labor, watery soup, guards spitting at them in contempt. Some imagined worse, dark fears born of propaganda that America treated its captives like cattle. But morning broke, and with it came a quiet reversal that none could have anticipated. Instead of stale bread tossed across a table, steaming mugs appeared once more. Instead of the clank of chains, there was the ordinary sound of a mess line. The pilots sat with their backs straight, eyes darting, waiting for the trick, for the cruelty hidden behind the gesture. Yet there was none. The guards poured, the cooks ladled, and the smell of roasted beans filled the air. It was almost unbearable. This contradiction. They had been enemies only days before, their bombs falling on Detroit's factories or New York's docks, and now the victors gave them a drink more precious than gold in Europe. The psychological effect was profound: to sit, captive and defeated. While sipping a cup of coffee was not just unexpected, it was destabilizing. It gnawed at their pride. Oberfeldwebel Hans Meissner wrote in his confiscated diary, "We had trained ourselves to endure hunger. We had prepared to be beaten. We were ready for all cruelties. But no one prepared us for kindness." For some, the kindness stung more sharply than any blow. Even within the barracks, the reaction split men apart. A few muttered that it was a trick, that the Americans sought to soften them before demanding confessions. Others, holding their mugs with trembling hands, admitted quietly that this enemy was not the monster painted in speeches back home. One rumor spread quickly that an American sergeant, whose brother had been killed by the Luftwaffe, still poured coffee for every German he guarded. The story might have been gossip, but its power lay in the suggestion that even the aggrieved could show restraint. The tension was visible in their posture. Men who had expected degradation instead found themselves treated with a peculiar dignity, and that dignity forced them to confront the weakness of their own ideology. As one German put it in hushed tones, "How can we call them barbarians when they give us what our own people cannot?" The silence that followed such questions was heavier than chains. That morning ritual would repeat itself, day after day, each mug of coffee reminding them of a truth more corrosive than punishment: the enemy's humanity. And it was precisely this reversal, this unexpected softness, that unsettled them most of all. The reversal of expectations soon revealed itself as something more than a daily courtesy. It became what some American officers later called a soft victory. No speeches were needed, no propaganda leaflets pressed into the prisoners' hands. The victory unfolded quietly, through the smell of coffee drifting across wooden barracks and the clatter of tin mugs in the morning light. American policy toward prisoners was guided by the Geneva Convention, but in practice, it often went further. Guards and camp commanders understood that feeding, clothing, and treating prisoners well reduced unrest and made their work easier. But there was also a deeper current, one that reflected America's self-image. By offering comforts, even small ones like coffee, they were proving something that democracy and abundance did not need brutality to enforce themselves. The system itself, with its farms producing more grain than Germany could imagine and its factories pouring out bombers by the hour, was its own propaganda. The Germans noticed. They whispered about the food, the rations, the steady supply of luxuries. "If this is captivity," one pilot murmured, "then our freedom was poorer than their chains." For men raised on stories of American weakness, it was disorienting. At the camp in Oklahoma, Luftwaffe officer Wilhelm Frank reportedly stared at his mug one morning and said simply, "This is victory, not their weapons, this." Statistics backed the symbolism. In 1944 alone, the United States imported more than 700 million pounds of coffee beans, enough to keep civilians, soldiers, and prisoners alike supplied. In contrast, Germany's imports had collapsed under Allied blockade. Substitutes of acorns and roasted barley filled the cups of its citizens. When prisoners learned these numbers from Red Cross bulletins, the realization sank deeper. America was fighting a war on multiple fronts while still giving real coffee to captives. It was not lost on the guards, either. Some took a quiet pride in the effect. A corporal from Kansas, writing to his family, admitted, "You can see it in their faces. They thought we would beat them down. Instead, we fill their cups. They don't know how to fight that." It was a different kind of weapon, one forged not of steel, but of perception. And perception was powerful. Each sip chipped away at the certainty with which the Germans had flown into battle. Every gesture contradicted the speeches of Goebbels. Every breakfast undermined the image of America as decadent and divided, without a single lecture. The prisoners began to see that this enemy's strength lay not only in industry and numbers, but in the confidence to be generous, even in victory. When the mornings ended and the mugs clattered back into the kitchens, silence lingered. The men were left to wrestle with the unsettling truth. America did not need to humiliate them. The quiet dignity of a hot drink was enough to prove who had already won. The comparison between life at the front and life in captivity grew more painful with each passing day. In Europe, German infantry crouched in muddy foxholes without warmth, gnawing at frozen bread or ersatz rations. Some units near the Eastern Front boiled weeds and horse bones for soup. Yet, in America, captured pilots awoke to a routine that included coffee, bread, and sometimes even eggs or fruit from local farms. The irony was brutal. The defeated tasted luxuries denied to those still fighting. Letters, heavily censored by U.S. authorities, revealed this paradox. One young flyer, Feldwebel Otto Brenner, wrote in pencil to his parents in Hamburg, "We drink coffee each morning, real coffee, strong and hot. Do not imagine I write this to boast. I only wish you could smell it once, if only once more." That letter never passed the censors, but fragments were copied by American intelligence officers. Curious at the raw emotion tucked into the lines, the words carried a sting not only for his family, but for his own sense of identity. To receive kindness from the enemy while one's homeland starved was a humiliation he could neither explain nor forget. Barracks gossip amplified the wound. Some men swore that German troops in Normandy had not seen real coffee in months. Others claimed that in Berlin, entire families shared a single spoonful of ersatz grounds. Each story, whether exaggerated or true, made the steaming mugs in their hands feel heavier, almost accusatory. To enjoy what their comrades could not was both comfort and torment. The guards, too, noticed the silence that fell over the Germans during breakfast. One American sergeant observed, "They drink without speaking. It is as though the coffee scolds them more than we ever could." For the Germans, the ritual was no longer just a kindness. It became a mirror reflecting the crumbling facade of their Reich. Some resisted, muttering that it was all part of an American trick. Others stared into their mugs with conflicted eyes, aware that no speech from Berlin could erase the evidence in their hands. The contrast was too sharp, the message too clear. And so I ask you, watching now if you were one of those pilots, seated in a camp thousands of miles from home, sipping coffee your own family could not taste, what would you feel, gratitude, shame, or something too complicated to name? Over time, the daily ritual of coffee transformed into something larger than nourishment. It was not just caffeine to keep men awake, it became a declaration. The Americans did not say it aloud, but every poured mug spoke, "We treat our prisoners with more dignity than your leaders give their own people." It was a message of civilization, of quiet confidence, more potent than any leaflet dropped from the sky. The Germans understood. Some refused to admit it openly, but the realization simmered in every conversation. Around barracks tables, pilots debated whether America's treatment of them was deliberate strategy or simple habit. One insisted it was clever psychological warfare. Another countered that it was genuine routine, an effortless generosity born of abundance, whichever side they believed. The conclusion was the same: the United States stood on a foundation of plenty that Germany could not match. Personal moments sharpened the lesson. A camp cook in Texas once slipped an extra ladle of coffee to a pilot whose hands trembled from cold. The man muttered a thank you in halting English. That night, in the dim light of his barracks, he admitted to his bunkmate, "They treat us as if we still had honor." Such words carried risk. To question Nazi ideology was dangerous even among fellow captives. Yet these quiet admissions began to ripple through the camp. Numbers underlined the point. By 1945, U.S. coffee consumption still averaged nearly 20 pounds per person each year, even as the war raged. In Germany, the figure had collapsed to almost nothing. Acorns and chicory filled the gap. Prisoners could not ignore what this meant. The nation they had been told was weak could fight on two oceans, feed its own people, and still share luxuries with captives. That realization was a wound deeper than any interrogation. The gossip of the camps reflected this shift. Some men joked bitterly that they hoped to be captured again if they survived the war. Others whispered that perhaps their leaders had lied to them from the start. Coffee had become the unlikely spark for doubt, a bitter drink carrying the taste of truth. And now a question for you. Do you believe kindness, offered at the right moment, can dismantle an ideology more effectively than punishment? Share your thoughts below. I read every perspective. As the war dragged to its bloody conclusion, the mornings in the American camps carried on with quiet regularity. Coffee at dawn, simple meals, work details in the fields or factories. Then back to barracks before nightfall. What seemed ordinary to the guards became extraordinary to the prisoners, for men who had once flown the skies in Messerschmitts, whose lives had been measured in missions and kills. The most lasting memory of their captivity was not a battle, it was the warmth of a cup held between their hands. Some carried that memory for decades. When repatriated to a ruined Germany in 1946, former Luftwaffe pilot Heinrich Krüger later told a historian, "I do not remember the faces of those who shot at me in the air. I remember the American who poured me coffee without a word." Such recollections echoed across veterans' memoirs, quiet admissions that the enemy's humanity had unsettled them more deeply than any loss in combat. The symbolism grew heavier with time. Coffee had become more than a drink. It was proof of America's abundance, a silent declaration of moral high ground, and a reminder that kindness could wound pride more sharply than cruelty. Each mug was a battlefield victory played out in miniature, reminding the prisoners that the Reich they had fought for was collapsing not only on the front lines, but in comparison with every small act of humanity their captors displayed. Numbers reinforced this memory. In total, more than 371,000 German prisoners passed through U.S. camps, each encountering the paradox of defeat and dignity. Tens of millions of gallons of coffee were brewed in those years, enough to mark countless mornings with the same silent gesture. No speech from Berlin could erase the fact that even in captivity, life in America held a richness their homeland could not provide. Perhaps the most haunting image was the morning silence itself. Dozens of men seated on rough benches, hands wrapped around tin mugs, steam curling into the light of daybreak. Some stared at the ground, others gazed across the camp fences, and all of them carried the same unspoken realization they were enemies, but they were still treated as men. That truth lingered long after the last cup was drained. And so the story ends, not with the roar of engines or the crack of gunfire, but with the soft hiss of steam rising from a mug. It was a moment that transcended war, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful victories are fought not with weapons, but with gestures of humanity. History often remembers the thunder of bombs, the blaze of dogfights, the maps marked in red and blue. Yet for those who lived it, memory is shaped just as much by the quiet moments, the small gestures that defied logic in times of violence. For the German pilots who found themselves behind barbed wire in America, the sound that endured was not the scream of engines or the crash of burning planes, but the hiss of boiling water poured into a battered tin mug. That cup of coffee became more than sustenance. It was a paradox, a contradiction that haunted them long after the war ended. The very nation they had tried to bomb into submission showed them civility, even comfort. It left a mark deeper than punishment, a reminder that the human spirit can resist hatred in ways more enduring than force. One veteran, decades later, confessed that even as he built a new life in post-war Germany, the smell of morning coffee carried him back to those barracks, to the shock of being treated with dignity by men he had once sworn to kill. There is a lesson here that stretches beyond the barbed wire of history. Power is not only measured in weapons or factories, but in the choice to extend humanity when cruelty would be easier. A cup of coffee placed in the hands of an enemy can echo across generations as a gesture that refuses to be forgotten. So perhaps the true victory was not only won in the skies over Europe, nor in the factories of Detroit, but in the unlikeliest of places, a prison camp at dawn, where kindness proved sharper than steel. Bomber engines have long since gone silent, but the memory of those mugs, steaming in the cool morning air, remains.